She woke up on her 5th wedding anniversary, expecting roses and champagne. Instead, she found ultrasound photos of another woman's baby in her husband's secret penthouse.
He lied to me.
Wedding invitations with his name
But I won't
and
let
his
him get
mistress's
away with
name
it.
printed in gold. And an email that read, "Once Caroline delivers, I will file for divorce. I will claim mental instability. Full custody will not be a problem." He was not planning to leave her. He was planning to take her baby and erase her completely. But when she confronted him that night, what happened next
In a
left her
stunning
bleeding on the
development
floor,
today, the jury
slipping
found
into a
Marcus
coma,
Hayes guilty
while
on
her
all
millionaire
counts in the
husband
financial
stepped over
scandal.
her body and
A
walked out
major
the door.
victory for the
He
prosecution.
thought money would protect him. He thought silence would bury the truth. He did not count on her 2 brothers. One was former Army intelligence. The other was a federal prosecutor, and they were coming for everything. Stay with me until the end of this story. Bob and I actually ended this story because the revenge they delivered made him pay in ways he never imagined. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are listening from right now. Drop a like if you love stories where the villain gets exactly what they deserve. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button so you never miss another story like this one. Now let us begin. Carolyn Mitchell woke alone on her 5th wedding anniversary. The morning light filtered through the silk curtains that cost more than her first car. 7 months pregnant, she shifted carefully in the king-size bed, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her belly. The baby kicked twice, strong and certain, and Caroline smiled despite the empty space beside her. Her husband, Marcus Hayes, had left before dawn. "An urgent investor meeting," he said. Something about a deal that could not wait. She had nodded sleepily and felt his lips brush her forehead before he disappeared into the darkness of early morning. She did not complain. Tonight, he had promised her dinner at the restaurant where he proposed 5 years ago. The same corner table, the same champagne, though she would only pretend to sip it now. The same view of the city lights spreading out below them like a blanket of stars. Caroline eased herself out of bed and moved to the window. Below, their estate stretched across 3 acres of manicured grounds. The pool sparkled in the morning sun. The gardens bloomed with flowers she could not name, tended by people she rarely saw. This was her life now. The wife of Marcus Hayes, CEO of Hayes Development Group, one of the most successful real estate developers on the East Coast. A man whose name appeared in business magazines and charity galas and the society pages of newspapers that still printed on paper. She touched her belly again. After 3 miscarriages, this pregnancy had survived. When they heard the heartbeat together at the 12-week scan, Marcus had wept. Actual tears running down his face while he held her hand and promised that everything would be different now, that they would finally be a real family. She had believed those tears were real. Carolyn showered and dressed in comfortable clothes, the kind she wore when she had no intention of leaving the house. She made herself breakfast in the kitchen that was larger than her childhood home, eating alone at a table designed for 12. The morning stretched ahead of her, empty and quiet. Marcus would not return until evening. The housekeeper had the day off. Even Thomas Reed, the household manager who had worked for the Hayes family for 15 years, was running errands in the city. She was alone with her thoughts and her growing child and the silence of a house too big for one person. It was the silence that drove her to the study. Caroline had never been a naive wife. Before marrying Marcus, she spent 7 years as a forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service, specializing in fraud detection. She had prosecuted men who hid money in offshore accounts, who created shell companies to funnel profits away from taxes, who believed their wealth placed them above the rules that governed ordinary people. She knew every trick. She had seen every scheme. She could spot a hidden transaction the way a musician spots a wrong note in a symphony. She gave up her career when Marcus proposed. He said he wanted her home, safe, building their family. He said he would provide everything she could ever need. He said her days of hunting other people's secrets were over. She agreed because she loved him. She agreed because she wanted the family he promised. She agreed because she believed him when he said he had nothing to hide. But old habits never die. Every quarter, Caroline reviewed their household finances. Not because she suspected anything, not because she doubted her husband, simply because patterns comforted her. Numbers did not lie. Numbers were safe. Numbers were the one constant in a world that seemed to shift beneath her feet. This morning, while Marcus was gone and the house was empty, she opened the tax documents for their joint accounts. It was routine, familiar, almost meditative in its predictability. Something caught her eye, a property tax payment for an address she did not recognize. A penthouse on Madison Avenue, purchased 18 months ago, listed under Hayes Holdings LLC, Marcus's private company, separate from their marital assets. Her forensic instincts woke up like a guard dog hearing footsteps in the night. She dug deeper. Wire transfers appeared on the screen. $15,000 monthly to an account she had never seen. The payments stretched back nearly 2 years, regular as clockwork, never missing a single month. Receipts for jewelry she never received. A diamond bracelet, pearl earrings, a necklace with stones she could not identify from the description alone. Flight bookings for 2 passengers to destinations Marcus had claimed were solo business trips. Paris in spring, the Caribbean in winter. A ski resort in Colorado where she had never set foot. The recipient's name appeared on a utility bill for the Madison penthouse. Victoria Cole. Caroline's hand stopped shaking. Her mind shifted from wife to investigator. The transition was seamless, automatic, like slipping into a language she had spoken her entire life. She did not cry. She documented. For the next 2 hours, she photographed every screen. She copied files to a USB drive she found in Marcus's desk drawer. She traced the money through shell companies and holding accounts, following the trail with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. By noon, she had assembled a picture that made her sick to her stomach. Marcus had been supporting another woman for nearly 2 years. An apartment, a lifestyle, jewelry and vacations, and a life that existed parallel to the one he shared with Caroline. But she was not finished yet. She needed to see it for herself. Caroline drove to Madison Avenue that afternoon. She wore her old IRS credential holder around her neck. The identification inside had expired 3 years ago, but building security rarely checked dates. They saw the official seal and the serious expression and assumed authority that no longer existed. She told the doorman she was conducting a financial audit related to a property dispute. He let her up without question. The penthouse was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Modern furniture arranged with the precision of a magazine photo shoot. Fresh flowers in crystal vases, replaced weekly by a service that Caroline's own household used. But the flowers were not what stopped her breath. Photographs covered the walls and shelves and side tables. Marcus and Victoria together. Vacations on white sand beaches. Dinners at restaurants Caroline recognized from her own anniversary celebrations. A Christmas tree in the corner of this very room, decorated with matching ornaments. Marcus and Victoria wearing matching pajamas while they smiled at the camera. The photos spanned years, 2 years at least, perhaps longer. Carolyn moved through the apartment like a ghost, touching nothing, seeing everything. On the refrigerator in the kitchen, held by a magnetic clip shaped like a heart, she found ultrasound photos. Victoria Cole was pregnant, 4 months along according to the date printed in the corner. Caroline's own baby kicked inside her, and she felt something break in her chest. Not her heart, something deeper, something she did not have a name for. She kept moving. In the bedroom closet, behind rows of designer dresses and shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, she found a wedding dress. Tag still attached. Custom sizing that would accommodate a growing belly. Beside the dress, a folder. Inside the folder, invitation drafts. The wedding of Marcus Hayes and Victoria Cole, scheduled for 3 months from now. A destination ceremony on a private island. Guest list included names Caroline recognized from Marcus's business dealings, people who had sat at her own dinner table and complimented her cooking. Her hands did not shake as she photographed everything. Her mind did not wander. She was not a wife discovering betrayal. She was an investigator building a case. But then she found the email. It was saved in the drafts folder of a laptop left open on the bedroom desk. Password protected, but the password was written on a sticky note attached to the screen. Victoria apparently was not careful about security. The email was from Marcus to Victoria, written 6 months ago. Once Caroline delivers, I will file for divorce. I will claim mental instability. Her history makes it easy. Full custody will not be a problem. Then we start fresh, you and me, the way it should have been from the beginning. Carolyn read the email 3 times. He was not planning to leave her. He was planning to take her baby and erase her. She copied the email to her USB drive. She copied everything she could find on the laptop: bank statements, calendar entries, text message backups that Victoria had saved to her cloud account. Then she left the penthouse the same way she entered, nodding politely to the doorman, walking to her car with steady steps. She did not cry until she was inside the vehicle with the doors locked and the engine running. Then she cried until she could not breathe. Then she stopped crying and drove home. There was work to do. Caroline arrived at the house before Marcus. She did not turn on the lights. She did not change her clothes. She sat in the living room with the USB drive in her pocket and her phone beside her. Photographs already uploaded to 3 separate cloud storage accounts that Marcus did not know existed. She waited. He arrived at 7 o'clock, flowers in hand, smile perfect. The suit he wore cost more than most families spent on groceries in a year. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. His watch was a brand she could not pronounce, given to him by a grateful client after a particularly lucrative deal. He looked like what he was: a successful man, a powerful man, a man who believed the world existed for his convenience. He said the words she had heard 100 times before. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart. Ready for our special night?" Carolyn stood slowly, using the arm of the chair for support. Her pregnant belly made everything harder. Standing, sitting, breathing, she looked at her husband. The man she had loved for 5 years. The man who had held her hand through 3 miscarriages. The man who had promised her forever. She spoke clearly, without emotion. "I went to Madison Avenue today." Marcus froze, his smile held for 1 second too long. "I do not know what you are talking about." His voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had practiced lying until it became second nature. "Victoria," Carolyn said, "the penthouse, the baby, the wedding invitations." She watched his face shift, not into guilt, not into shame, into calculation. He was not thinking about what he had done. He was thinking about damage control. "Whatever you think you found," he began. "I found so much, found everything." Carolyn cut him off. "I documented everything. Tomorrow I am calling my brothers. Then I am calling a divorce attorney." Marcus stepped closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You are not calling anyone." "Yes," Carolyn said, "I am." Marcus moved faster than Caroline expected. He grabbed her phone from her hand and threw it against the wall. The screen shattered on impact, pieces of glass scattering across the hardwood floor like broken promises. Caroline tried to reach the landline on the side table. He blocked her path. "Do you have any idea what you will destroy?" His voice rose with each word. "My company, my reputation, my future. Your future was built on lies, and you will keep quiet about those lies." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore, the same cologne she had bought him for their last anniversary. "You will have this baby. You will sign whatever papers I put in front of you. You will disappear quietly with a settlement that lets you live comfortably for the rest of your life. And you will never speak about any of this to anyone." Carolyn looked at the man she had married, the man she had trusted with her life and her future and her unborn child. "No," she said, the word hung in the air between them. "No." Such a small word, such a simple word, 2 letters that changed everything. Marcus's composure cracked. The controlled businessman vanished. The charming husband disappeared. What remained was something darker. Something that had always been there, hiding beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it no longer needed to hide. This was a man who had never been told no by anyone he considered beneath him. He grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into her skin with a force that would leave bruises. Carolyn tried to pull away, but her pregnant body was slow, heavy. Her center of balance shifted in ways she still was not accustomed to. She could not move the way she used to move. He shoved her. She hit the wall at an angle her arms could not protect against. Her shoulder struck first, then her head. Pain exploded behind her eyes. She fell. Her belly struck the edge of a table on the way down. The pain that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Sharp and deep and wrong in a way that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to something primal. She cried out once, then again when he kicked her. She saw blood spreading beneath her, dark against the hardwood floor that Marcus had imported from Italy. because he said American wood was not good enough for his home. She felt her consciousness slipping away. The room grew dim at the edges. Sounds became muffled, distant, as if she were sinking underwater. Her last coherent thought was not about herself. My baby. Please save my baby. Marcus stood over her, breathing hard. For a long moment, he simply watched. He watched his wife bleeding on his expensive floor. He watched her eyes flutter closed. He watched her body go still. Then he checked his watch. He stepped over her body without a second glance. He walked to the bedroom they had shared for 5 years and packed a bag with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. Clean shirts, a spare suit, his passport, just in case. He walked to the door. He did not call for help. He did not dial 911. He did not check to see if his wife was still breathing. He called his attorney instead. Richard, he said when the line connected, we have a situation. Richard Crane had been making problems disappear for Hayes Development for 15 years. He had buried scandals and silenced accusers and arranged settlements that kept Marcus's name out of headlines. He was very good at his job. How bad? Richard asked. Caroline found everything. Victoria, the accounts, the wedding plans. Did she make copies? I do not know. She said she documented everything. Where is she now? Marcus paused. He looked back at the living room, at the still form on the floor, at the blood spreading in a dark pool. Home, I assume. We had an argument. She fell. Silence on the line. She fell, Richard repeated. That is the story. Pregnancy complications. Dizziness. Tragic accident. Richard paused. He had defended guilty men before. He knew the difference between a client who made a mistake and a client who made a choice. I will handle it, he said finally. Do not contact the hospital. Do not go home. Do not make any statements until I tell you exactly what to say. Marcus hung up. He walked to his car. He drove to Victoria's penthouse. Behind him, his wife lay motionless on the floor. The lights stayed on. The blood continued to spread. The silence of the empty house were pressed down like a weight. No one came. Thomas Reed returned to the house later that night. He had worked for the Hayes family for 15 years, starting as a groundskeeper when Marcus's father still ran the company. Over the years, he had become the household manager, the person who kept everything running while remaining invisible, the man who knew where the spare keys were hidden and when the cleaning service came and which wines Marcus preferred for different occasions. He returned at 9 o'clock to drop off dry cleaning. A simple errand, routine, the kind of task he had performed 1,000 times. But the house felt wrong. The lights were on in the living room, visible through the windows as he approached. That was unusual. Carolyn preferred soft lighting in the evenings, lamps rather than overheads. She said the bright lights gave her headaches. Marcus's car was gone. That was not unusual. But the silence that greeted Thomas when he opened the door was different. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house. Something heavier. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He called out. His voice echoed through empty rooms. No answer. He moved through the hallway, his footsteps loud against the polished floors. He called Caroline's name. Still no answer. Then he reached the living room. She lay on the floor, motionless, surrounded by blood. Her face was pale, her breathing was shallow. Her body was twisted at an unnatural angle that made Thomas's stomach lurch. For a moment, he froze. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Then training kicked in. Not professional training. Life training. Thomas had grown up in a neighborhood where violence was common. He had seen fights on street corners. He had seen the aftermath of disputes that went too far. He recognized what this was. This was not an accident. This was not a fall. This was a beating. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Suon. His voice was steady as he gave the address, described what he found, answered the dispatcher's questions. He stayed on the line, following instructions, checking Caroline's pulse, afraid to move her but needing to know she was still alive. She was. Barely. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, assessing her condition, stabilizing her for transport, loading her onto a stretcher. Thomas rode in the ambulance. He sat near her feet, watching the medical team work, listening to their clipped exchanges. At one point, one of the paramedics spoke quietly to another. Fetal heart rate is weak. We need to move. The vehicle accelerated. At the hospital, Carolyn was rushed inside without delay. Thomas followed until he could not follow anymore. Stopped by doors that required authorization he did not have. He gave his name. He explained how he found her. He answered questions from a nurse, and then a doctor, and then a police officer who appeared without warning. Then he was asked to wait. Minutes became hours. The waiting room was cold and impersonal. The chairs were uncomfortable. The magazines on the table were months old. Finally, a doctor emerged. The news was grim. Carolyn had severe internal injuries, bleeding that required emergency surgery, trauma to her abdomen that put the pregnancy at extreme risk. She had slipped into a coma. But the baby? Thomas heard himself ask the question. What about the baby? The doctor paused. They had performed an emergency cesarean section. A girl, premature, only weighing 4 pounds, but alive. Fighting. The doctors called her a fighter. Thomas sat in the waiting room with bloodstains still on his shirt. He thought about the scene at the house, the blood on the floor, Marcus's car gone. No sign of emergency calls, no evidence that anyone had tried to help. He thought about the man he had watched grow from a spoiled child into a powerful businessman. The man who smiled for cameras and charmed investors and treated the people who worked for him like furniture to be moved when convenient. He thought about Caroline, who always said please and thank you, who asked about his daughter's teaching job, who remembered his birthday when her own husband forgot. He thought about the baby girl fighting for her life in the NICU. Then he made the most important phone call of his life. David Mitchell answered on the third ring. His voice was alert despite the late hour. 11:47 at night in Virginia, where he ran a private security firm staffed by former military and law enforcement personnel. The kind of men who knew how to find information that did not want to be found. "This is Thomas Reed," Thomas said. "I work for Marcus Hayes. I found your sister tonight." David listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, he asked one question. "Where is Marcus now? Gone. Left before I found her. His car is not at the house. He has not called the hospital." Silence on the line. Then David spoke, his voice calm but carrying an edge that Thomas recognized. The sound of controlled fury. "Stay with her. We are coming." Within minutes, Michael Mitchell was on the line. Caroline's younger brother, a federal prosecutor in Chicago who specialized in organized crime and financial fraud. The kind of lawyer who put away men who thought they were untouchable. Thomas repeated everything. The condition of the house, the state of Caroline's injuries, Marcus's absence, the baby in the NICU. Neither brother panicked. Neither brother wasted time on questions that could wait. They listened. They absorbed. They began to move. By 1 in the morning, both brothers had canceled everything. Meetings, court appearances, family obligations. Nothing mattered except getting to their sister. By 3 in the morning, they were on separate flights heading east. By 6 in the morning, they walked into the hospital together. They did not speak in the elevator. They did not need to. Thomas was waiting in the ICU waiting room. He stood when he saw them. David shook his hand firmly. "You saved her life," David said. "I just made a phone call." "That phone call was everything," Michael added. They entered Caroline's room together. She lay motionless beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Tubes and wires connected her to machines that measured what her body could no longer communicate. Her face was bruised. Her hands were limp. The machines breathed for her with a steady rhythm that seemed both mechanical and sacred. David stood at the foot of the bed. Michael stood at her side. Neither man cried, but both made a silent promise. Marcus Hayes would pay. Not with anger, not with impulse, with precision, with patience, with complete destruction. Marcus was not hiding. From Victoria's penthouse, he watched the city lights spread out below him and planned his next move. The scotch in his hand was 18 years old. The woman beside him was 20 years younger than his wife. He called his attorney at 7 in the morning. Richard Crane answered on the first ring. The man never slept, as far as Marcus could tell. He was always available, always prepared, always one step ahead of whatever disaster his clients created. "How bad is it?" Richard asked. "The situation is manageable. Caroline is in the hospital. Apparently she had a fall. A fall. Pregnancy complications, dizziness. The kind of thing that happens to women in her condition." Richard was quiet for a moment. "And the evidence she mentioned? The documentation?" I have people looking for it. Her phone was destroyed in the fall. If she made copies, we will find them. Richard sighed, the sound of a man who had cleaned up too many messes to be surprised by another one. Here is what we do, he said. You release a statement expressing concern for your wife. You visit the hospital once, briefly, with witnesses present. You do not answer questions. You do not speculate. You simply appear to be a grieving husband dealing with a tragic accident. And if she wakes up, we will deal with that when it happens. For now, the narrative is simple. She fell. You were not home. You are devastated. Marcus nodded, though Richard could not see him. By afternoon, the narrative was set. News outlets received a carefully crafted press release. Hayes Development CEO Marcus Hayes reports that his wife suffered a tragic fall at their home last night. She is currently hospitalized in serious condition. Mr. Hayes asked for privacy during this difficult time and requests prayers for his wife's recovery. Marcus visited the hospital at 2 o'clock. He brought flowers. He spoke to doctors in a voice heavy with concern. He asked questions about treatment options and prognosis and when his beloved wife might be expected to wake. He held the newborn baby for exactly 3 photographs, just long enough to establish his role as a caring father, just long enough for the images to spread across social media with comments about the devoted husband keeping vigil during tragedy. He did not enter Caroline's room. He claimed he could not bear to see her like this. The cameras captured a grieving husband. The headlines read, CEO rushes to wife's side after tragic accident. David and Michael watched the news segment from the hospital cafeteria. The television in the corner played on mute, but the images were clear enough. Marcus with flowers, Marcus with the baby, Marcus looking appropriately devastated. He is controlling the narrative, Michael observed. For now, David replied. That night, David drove to the house alone. He knew the security code. Carolyn had shared it with him years ago during a conversation about emergencies and contingencies and what to do if something ever happened. She had always been careful that way, always thinking ahead. The house was dark. Police tape covered the front door, but David entered through the side. He was not interested in the crime scene. He was interested in something else. The security panel was in a closet near the back entrance. State-of-the-art equipment made by a company David's own firm had contracts with. He knew the architecture. He knew the vulnerabilities. What he found made his stomach drop. The cameras had been disabled at 6:47 in the evening, 13 minutes before Marcus arrived home according to the timeline the police had established. They were reactivated at 8:23, after Marcus left, after the attack, after Caroline lay bleeding on the floor without anyone to help her. The footage from that window did not exist. It had been deleted remotely using administrator credentials. Marcus had not simply attacked his wife in a moment of rage. He had planned it. He had disabled the cameras before walking through the door. He had known exactly what he was going to do before he did it. David stared at the security panel. His jaw tightened. Premeditated, he said quietly to himself. But David knew something Marcus did not. Modern security systems had redundancy. Data was stored locally and uploaded to secure cloud servers. Even if local footage was deleted, fragments often remained on the cloud, especially during system reboots or software updates. He contacted his firm's tech specialist. Within hours, they recovered a partial backup. 17 seconds of footage from a hallway camera that briefly activated during a system glitch. The footage showed Marcus dragging Caroline by the arm. It showed him raising his hand. It cut out before the worst. It was not complete, but it was enough. David brought the footage to Michael in the hospital cafeteria at 3 in the morning. We have got him, David said. They took the footage to the police the next day. Detective Rachel Adams reviewed it in a small conference room at the station. She was in her 40s with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. She watched the 17 seconds without expression. When it ended, she looked up. This contradicts his statement. He said she fell. This shows assault. Can you arrest him? Michael asked. The detective hesitated. This footage shows him grabbing her. It does not show the actual beating. A defense attorney will argue it is inconclusive. But combined with her injuries, David pressed, we need more. Medical testimony that the injuries are inconsistent with a fall. Witness statements. A pattern of behavior. She stood, gathering the files. I believe you. I believe this footage. But believing is not enough to convict. We need a case that will hold in court. The brothers left the station frustrated, but not defeated. She is right, Michael said as they walked to the car. We need to build something airtight. Then we build it. But Marcus was building something too. Within 48 hours, someone in the police department talked. Someone always talked when enough money was involved. Richard Crane learned about the partial footage and moved fast. He filed a motion challenging the admissibility of the evidence. His argument was simple. The footage was illegally obtained by the victim's brother, who accessed the property without authorization and retrieved data from a private security system without a warrant. The filing included phrases like fruit of the poisonous tree in violation of Fourth Amendment protections, legal language designed to exclude evidence that might otherwise send his client to prison. The judge granted a temporary hold on the evidence pending review. But that was not the worst part. The same day, a story appeared on a popular news website. The headline read, "Questions surround evidence in Hayes case. Was it manufactured?" The article suggested that David Mitchell, described as a former military intelligence operative with connections to private security firms, may have fabricated or manipulated the footage to frame his brother-in-law. Comments flooded social media. Supporters of Marcus, people who had never met him but admired his success, shared the article thousands of times. Rich guy's wife falls down and suddenly her military brother has secret footage? Convenient. Gold digger family trying to take down a successful man. Why did she not call the police herself if she was so scared? The narrative shifted. Marcus was the victim of a smear campaign. Caroline's family were opportunists trying to extract money from a wealthy man. David read the comments in the hospital waiting room. His hands did not shake. His face did not change. But his eyes went cold. The catastrophes came in threes. First, Marcus's attorneys filed for emergency custody of the baby. Their argument was logical, even reasonable on paper. Caroline was in a coma with uncertain recovery. Marcus was the biological father with no criminal record. The child needed stability, not a hospital waiting room. She needed a home. The family court judge reviewed the petition. There were no formal charges against Marcus. The assault footage was under legal review. On paper, he was nothing more than a concerned father. Temporary custody was granted. Victoria picked up the baby from the hospital. She posted a photo on social media that same day. The image showed her holding the infant, smiling at the camera, looking every inch the devoted stepmother. "Family is everything," the caption read, "praying for this little angel's mommy." The photo received 50,000 likes within hours. Second, Thomas Reed became a target. A man approached him in the hospital parking lot on a Tuesday evening. Well-dressed, professional. The kind of man who blended into crowds and left no impression behind. He handed Thomas an envelope. Inside were cashier's checks totaling $250,000. "Mr. Hayes appreciates your years of service," the man said. "He would like you to clarify your statement. You found Mrs. Hayes at the bottom of the stairs. You did not see what happened before." Simple. Thomas stared at the envelope. The checks were real, more money than he would earn in a decade of honest work. "Get away from me," he said. "Think about your daughter, Mr. Reed. She teaches elementary school, does she not? Third grade at Lincoln Elementary? It would be a shame if the school board received anonymous complaints about her conduct." Thomas's face hardened. He had worked for the Hayes family for 15 years. He had changed Marcus's diapers when the boy was an infant. He had watched him grow into whatever he was now. "You tell Marcus Hayes something for me. I will watch him fall." He threw the envelope at the man's feet and walked away. 2 days later, Thomas's daughter received notice that she was under investigation for inappropriate interactions with students. The complaint was anonymous. There was no evidence. But she was placed on administrative leave pending review. Thomas could not prove the connection, but he knew. Third, Marcus's attorneys filed a motion to have Caroline declared legally incapacitated. If granted, Marcus, as her husband, would gain full control over her medical decisions, including the authority to transfer her to a different facility, including the authority to discuss end-of-life options if her condition did not improve. Michael argued against the motion in family court. He presented evidence of the marital conflict. He presented the partial footage. He presented medical records suggesting the injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. The judge was sympathetic but bound by procedure. There are no criminal charges against Mr. Hayes at this time. The footage is under legal review. Until Mrs. Hayes can speak for herself, her husband remains her legal next of kin. The motion was granted. David and Michael stood outside the courthouse in the afternoon sun. The weight of 3 consecutive defeats pressed down on them. He has custody of her daughter, David said quietly. He is threatening our witnesses. Now he controls whether she lives or dies. We are losing, David looked at his brother. His voice was calm, absolute. Then we stopped playing by his rules. David did not sleep. He rented an apartment near the hospital and converted it into a command center. Whiteboards covered the walls, filled with names and dates and connections drawn in different colored markers. Computers hummed on folding tables. Secure phone lines connected him to contacts across the country. His security firm had resources that most people never knew existed. Former military personnel who knew how to conduct surveillance without being detected. Former law enforcement officers who understood how investigations worked from the inside. Tech specialists who could trace digital footprints through layers of encryption and misdirection. He assigned a team to watch Marcus Hayes. Within 3 days, David knew everything. Marcus's daily schedule, down to the minute. The times he left Victoria's penthouse. The routes he took to his office. The restaurants where he ate lunch and the bars where he drank in the evening. The names of everyone who visited the penthouse. Business associates, lawyers. A procession of people who came and went with the regularity of clockwork. Records of every call Marcus made on his personal phone. Who he contacted. How long they spoke. The patterns that emerged from weeks of documented conversations. A complete list of every property owned by Hayes Development. Office buildings and residential complexes and vacant lots purchased for future development. An empire of real estate spread across 3 states. But David was not gathering evidence for court. Not yet. He was looking for pressure points, weaknesses. The places where Marcus's carefully constructed life was held together with lies. Michael took a different approach. As a federal prosecutor, he knew that wealthy men rarely went to prison for violence. The system was built to protect them. Good lawyers and sympathetic judges and juries that struggled to believe a man in a nice suit could be capable of brutality. But wealthy men often went to prison for money. Michael contacted colleagues in the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. He shared what Caroline had told him years ago during conversations she probably did not remember having. She had always thought something was off about Marcus's business. The numbers never quite added up. The projects that were announced with fanfare but somehow never got built. The investors who seemed satisfied despite returns that should have been impossible. A quiet investigation began. Not into the assault, into Hayes Development. Within a week, patterns emerged. Hayes Development took money from investors for real estate projects, commercial buildings, residential complexes, mixed-use developments in growing neighborhoods. The projects were announced with glossy presentations and confident projections and the full weight of Marcus Hayes's reputation. But many of them never got built. The money disappeared into a maze of shell companies, accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland and other jurisdictions that made tracking difficult. Payments that circled through multiple entities before vanishing entirely. It was not just fraud, it was a Ponzi scheme with buildings. He has been stealing from investors for years, Michael said during a late-night meeting at the command center apartment. If we can prove it, he loses everything. And if he loses everything, David replied, he cannot buy his way out of what he did to Caroline. But the brothers did not forget Thomas Reed. David assigned 2 members of his team to protect Thomas and his family. Discreet surveillance, background checks on anyone new in their lives. Eyes on his daughter's apartment around the clock. The anonymous complaint against Thomas's daughter was investigated. Michael made a call to a contact in the state education board. Someone who owed him a favor from a case years ago. The complaint was reviewed and dismissed within a week. No evidence, no merit, clearly malicious. Thomas's daughter returned to work. David visited Thomas personally at the hospital where the older man still had vigil outside Caroline's room. You did not have to refuse that money, David said. You could have taken it and walked away. No, Thomas replied. I could not. Why not? Thomas was quiet for a moment. His eyes were tired but clear. Because I was there when Emma was born. I heard her first cry. I held her before her father did because her father was not there. He was at his girlfriend's apartment, pretending his wife and child did not exist. He looked at David with an intensity that surprised them both. That little girl deserves a mother, and her mother deserves justice. I may not be able to give her that, but I can tell the truth. That is all I have ever had. David put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. You are family now. Whatever happens, we protect family. Victoria came to the hospital 3 days later. She told the staff she was a family friend. They led her into the ICU without question. She walked past nurses and monitors and the quiet hum of machines keeping Caroline alive. She stood over Caroline's unconscious body and watched the machine breathe for her. You know what is funny? Victoria said to the woman who could not hear her. He told me you were boring, cold, that you never appreciated him. She leaned closer, close enough that her perfume might have been detectable if Caroline had been aware. But I think you were just too smart for him. You saw through him, did you not? That is why he had to do this, not because you threatened him, but because you understood him. She held up her hand. Aww. The engagement ring caught the light, diamonds sparkling against fluorescent glare. It does not matter now. Once the doctors give up, Marcus will make the compassionate choice. Let her go peacefully. That is how he will phrase it. She took her phone from her purse and snapped a photo of Caroline in the hospital bed. She did not post it, not yet. She saved it for later. And Emma? She will call me mommy. She will grow up in the penthouse. She will never know you existed except as a sad story Marcus tells at charity dinners. She patted Caroline's limp hand. Sleep tight. She turned to leave. But the room was not empty. Thomas Reed stood in the doorway. He had heard everything. He told David and Michael that same evening. They listened in silence as he repeated Victoria's words, her casual cruelty, her certainty that she had already won. When Thomas finished, Michael's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage barely contained. She is planning to let Caroline die, he said. Not planning, David corrected. Preparing. She is building the narrative now. We have to do something. David nodded slowly. We will, but not yet. Not until we have everything we need. And if Caroline does not have that long? David did not answer, because he did not have one. That night, after Thomas had gone home and Michael had retreated to make phone calls, David sat alone in Caroline's hospital room. He held her hand. It was limp and cool, attached to monitors that beeped with mechanical regularity. Wake up, Caroline, please. We need you to wake up. The machines hummed. Caroline did not stir. David stayed until dawn, watching his sister breathe through tubes, wondering if he would ever hear her voice again. On day 23, Caroline opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was fluorescent lights. The first thing she heard was beeping machines. The first thing she felt was pain. Everywhere, her body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled incorrectly. A nurse noticed the movement. Doctors rushed in. Tests were conducted. Questions were asked. Caroline's voice was weak, but her mind was clear. My baby, she said. The words scraped through a throat dry from weeks of disuse. Your daughter is alive, the doctor said. She is healthy. She is in the NICU, but doing well. Where is she? The doctor hesitated. Caroline saw the hesitation and felt something cold settle in her chest. Where is my daughter? The doctor stepped back. David and Michael entered the room. David sat beside her bed. He took her hand, the same hand he had held during those long nights of waiting, and he told her everything. The custody ruling, the incapacitation order, Victoria's visit, as reported by Thomas, the threats against witnesses, the media campaign painting her family as opportunists, everything they had discovered about Marcus's business, the shell companies, the investor fraud, the pattern of crimes that stretched back years. Caroline listened without crying. When David finished, her voice was stronger than it had any right to be. He has my daughter, temporarily. He controls my medical decisions. For now. Caroline looked at both brothers. Her eyes were the eyes of the woman who had once brought down tax cheats and money launderers for the IRS, the woman Marcus thought he had broken. Then we take it all back, she said. His reputation, his money, His freedom. Everything. We have been working on it, David replied. Good. Now let me tell you what I found before he tried to kill me. Caroline's USB drive had survived. She had hidden it in a place Marcus would never think to look. Not in the house, not in her car, not in any of the obvious locations a paranoid husband might search. She had mailed it to herself at a post office box she maintained under her maiden name. A box she had kept for years, a remnant of her days at the IRS when paranoia about paper trails was professional necessity rather than personal precaution. David retrieved it the day after she woke. The contents were devastating. Bank records showing transfers from Hayes Development, investor accounts, to shell companies that existed only on paper. Shell company documentation that traced ownership through layers of corporations and jurisdictions designed to frustrate investigators. Internal emails between Marcus and his accountants discussing creative solutions to cash flow problems. Spreadsheets that showed exactly where investor money went. It did not go to buildings. He has been running a fraud for at least 5 years, Caroline explained, her voice gaining strength as she walked her brothers through the documents. The penthouse, Victoria's lifestyle, our house, the cars, the vacations, all of it paid for with stolen money. This is enough to bring federal charges, Michael said. I know, I used to build cases like this for a living. She looked at David. But I do not want him just to go to prison. I want him destroyed. I want everyone who protected him to fall. I want him to lose everything before he loses his freedom. What do you need? Carolyn thought about Victoria, about the woman who had stood over her hospital bed and whispered about stealing her daughter, about the engagement ring and the wedding dress and the future Victoria imagined for herself. I need Victoria to turn on him. Carolyn knew that Victoria would not flip easily. She was too invested, too protected, too convinced that she was special, that she was different from all the women who came before. But Caroline also knew something Marcus did not realize she knew. During her investigation of the penthouse, she had found more than evidence of Victoria. She had found evidence of others. Lindsay Morgan, an assistant at Hayes Development who received $50,000 in a signed non-disclosure agreement 5 years ago. She left the company shortly after and never worked in real estate again. Rachel Wade, a real estate agent who had been rising quickly through the industry until she suddenly disappeared from the business after a settlement with an unnamed Hayes Development executive. Brittany Cole, Victoria's own sister, who received a single payment of $25,000 3 years ago for reasons not specified in any document Caroline could find. Caroline sent David to find them. One by one, they agreed to talk. Off the record at first, nervous, reluctant, afraid of the consequences of speaking against a powerful man. But Caroline's evidence gave them courage. The knowledge that they were not alone, that there was a pattern, that what had happened to them had happened to others. They spoke on the record. Each woman told a similar story. Marcus had pursued them, charming at first, attentive, making them feel special, chosen. Different from everyone else in his orbit, Marcus had made promises. Career advancement, financial security, a future together that shimmered with possibility. Marcus had gotten what he wanted, and when they became inconvenient, Marcus made them disappear. With money, with threats, with legal documents that ensured their silence. Victoria was not the first. She was not even the second. She was just the current one. Caroline arranged a meeting. Not at the hospital, not at the penthouse, at a coffee shop in a neighborhood where neither woman would normally be seen. Neutral territory, public enough to feel safe, private enough to speak freely. Victoria arrived suspicious but curious. She wore sunglasses despite the overcast day, designer clothes that screamed wealth, an attitude that suggested she was doing Caroline a favor by showing up at all. Caroline arrived with a folder. "You should be dead," Victoria said by way of greeting. "Sorry to disappoint. What do you want?" "To show you something." Carolyn opened the folder. Photographs, documents, bank records, evidence of Lindsay, Rachel, and Brittany, evidence of the pattern. "You are not his future, Victoria. You are his present. When he gets bored, there will be another you. There is always another." Victoria stared at the documents. Her face cycled through emotions. Disbelief, denial, anger directed at Caroline for bringing this unwanted truth into her carefully constructed fantasy. This could be faked. Call Brittany, Caroline said. Your own sister. Ask her about the summer of 2021. Ask her why she suddenly had money to pay off her student loans. Victoria's face went pale. He slept with your sister, Victoria. He paid her off and made her sign papers. And she never told you because she was ashamed. Silence stretched between them. Carolyn leaned forward. You can stay with him. You can have his baby and raise my daughter and pretend you are happy. And in 2 years, maybe 3, he will find someone younger, prettier, less complicated. And you will get an envelope full of money and a document that says you can never talk about what happened. She paused. Or you can help me destroy him and walk away with your dignity intact. Victoria's hands were shaking. What do you want me to do? The meeting at the penthouse happened 3 days later. Victoria wore a wire. Military-grade equipment provided by David's team. Undetectable by any standard sweep Marcus might think to perform. She had been coached on what questions to ask, what topics to raise, how to steer the conversation without seeming to steer it. Marcus was relaxed, confident. He had been winning for weeks. The custody of the baby, the incapacitation order, the media narrative painting Caroline's family as opportunists. Everything was going according to plan. He talked freely. Caroline's family is desperate, he said, sipping scotch in the living room of the penthouse he had bought for his mistress. They are throwing everything at me, but nothing sticks. What about the footage, the partial recording? Inadmissible. My lawyer made sure of it. And the assault? What if she wakes up and talks? Marcus smiled, the smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. If she wakes up, it is her word against mine. She fell. Pregnancy complications. Tragic accident. I have told that story so many times. I almost believe it myself. But what really happened? Marcus looked at Victoria. He trusted her completely. She was his future, his partner, the woman who would stand beside him once Caroline was disposed of. She threatened to expose everything. You, the money, the other properties. So I did what I had to do. You hit her. I protected everything I built. She should have stayed quiet. That is all she had to do. The wire caught every word. Michael took the recording to his contacts in the FBI the next morning. Combined with Caroline's financial evidence, it was devastating. The confession of assault, the documentation of fraud, the pattern of witness intimidation, the obstruction of justice. The Bureau opened a formal investigation into Hayes' development. Assets were frozen pending review. Marcus's bank accounts, properties, and business holdings were locked under federal authority. Emergency motions were filed to reverse the custody order and the incapacitation order, citing new evidence of criminal activity. For 24 hours, the brothers believed they had won. Carolyn held Emma for the first time since the attack. The baby was small but healthy, eyes wide and curious, tiny fingers curling around her mother's thumb. "Hi, baby," Carolyn whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy is here. Mommy is not going anywhere." David and Michael stood back, watching. For a moment, the weight of the past weeks lifted. "It is over," Michael said. "Almost," David replied, but it was not over. Someone talked. Within 48 hours, a story broke on a major news website. FBI investigation based on illegally obtained recording. Evidence may be thrown out. The article claimed Victoria had been coerced into wearing the wire by Carolyn's brothers. It suggested the recording was manipulated by David's security firm. It quoted anonymous sources within the Bureau expressing concerns about the chain of custody. Marcus's attorney filed an immediate motion to suppress the recording. He argued it was obtained through intimidation of a witness and represented fruit of the poisonous tree. Worse, Marcus went on the offensive. He gave an interview to a sympathetic journalist, tears in his eyes, voice breaking with practiced emotion. "My wife and I were having problems. I am not proud of that. But I never hurt her. She fell. It was an accident. And now her family is trying to destroy me because they want my money." He produced documents showing that Caroline had consulted divorce lawyers before the incident. She was planning to leave me and take everything. When she fell, they saw an opportunity. This is a shakedown disguised as justice. The interview went viral. Comments flooded in. He seems so sincere. The brothers are obviously running a scheme. Gold digger family. The FBI investigation did not stop, but it slowed. Political pressure mounted. The case became complicated. Carolyn watched the interview from her hospital room. She saw the comments. She saw the doubt spreading like infection. She looked at Emma, sleeping in a bassinet beside her bed. "He is going to win," she said quietly. "He is going to take her again." Michael sat across from her, his face tight with frustration. "The FBI case is still open. It does not matter. He is winning the narrative. By the time any trial happens, everyone will believe him, will believe." The jury pool is already poisoned. David stood by the window, arms crossed, staring at nothing. "Then we changed the narrative." "How?" He turned. "We stop waiting for the system. We take the story public ourselves. That is risky. It could backfire. Everything has already backfired. We have played by the rules, and he has used the rules against us. It is time to play a different game." He looked at Caroline. "We need a journalist, someone with reach, someone who cannot be bought." Caroline thought for a long moment. Then she remembered a face from years ago, a name from her days at the IRS. "I know someone." Elena Vance was 45 years old and had won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. She specialized in stories that powerful people did not want told. Corporate fraud, political corruption, the quiet crimes of the wealthy that never made headlines because the victims were too scared or too poor or too dead to speak for themselves. She had been trying to get a story on Hayes development for 2 years. Sources hinted at irregularities. Former employees whispered about projects that never got built. But no one would go on record. No one would provide documents. The wall of silence around Marcus Hayes was too thick to breach. Until Caroline. They met in a conference room at the hospital. Elena brought a recorder and a notepad and decades of experience reading people who might be lying. Caroline brought everything. The financial evidence from the USB drive, the recording of Marcus admitting to the assault, the testimony from Lindsay and Rachel and Brittany, Victoria's cooperation and what she had witnessed, medical records, police reports, the complete timeline of events from the anniversary night to the present day. Elena reviewed the materials for 3 hours. She asked questions that probed for weaknesses. She looked for inconsistencies. She tested the evidence against every standard that a court or a skeptical reader might apply. When she finished, she looked at Caroline with something like respect. "This is explosive," she said. "Can you run it? I will need verification. Independent sources, multiple angles, you will have them." Elena studied Caroline carefully. The bruises had faded, the physical wounds had healed, but something else showed in her eyes, not just determination, something harder, something forged. "You know what this means. Your whole life will be public. Everything, the good and the bad, the good and the bad. I do not care about my privacy. I care about my daughter growing up knowing the truth." Elena nodded slowly. "Give me 2 weeks." While Elena built the story, David took more direct action. He approached Marcus's business partners one by one. The investors who had been making money from Hayes development. The executives who had looked the other way when the numbers did not add up. The lawyers and accountants who had helped construct the maze of shell companies that hid the fraud. He showed them evidence. Documents that traced exactly where their money had gone. Timelines that proved they had profited from investor funds that were supposed to build buildings that never broke ground. He gave them a choice. You can cooperate with the investigation now, or you can wait until the FBI comes knocking. When they come, they will not distinguish between Marcus and the people who helped him. You will all go down together. He paused. Or you can help us. Testify about what you know. Provide documents you have been hiding. And when this is over, you will be witnesses instead of defendants. One by one they flipped. Witnesses who had stayed silent for years suddenly remembered details. Documents that had been lost in the chaos of corporate record-keeping suddenly reappeared. The wall of protection around Marcus began to crumble. Michael worked through official channels. He could not prosecute the case himself. Conflict of interest? But he could ensure it was handled correctly. He reached out to the United States Attorney's Office. He presented the evidence personally, walking prosecutors through every document, every transaction, every lie. He answered questions for 6 hours without a break. At the end, the lead prosecutor looked at him with an expression that combined admiration and exhaustion. This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I have ever seen. Will you take it? Yes. And we will add the obstruction charges and the witness tampering. By the time we are done, Marcus Hayes will not be able to buy a cup of coffee. Michael allowed himself one small smile. Good. Elena's article dropped on a Sunday morning. The timing was deliberate. Sundays were when stories got maximum attention, when people had time to read, when news cycles stretched to fill the empty hours. The headline filled screens across the country. Empire of Lies, how millionaire Marcus Hayes built a fortune on fraud and nearly got away with murder. The story was devastating. It included the full financial fraud documentation, traced through years of transactions and shell companies and stolen investor funds. It included the recording of Marcus admitting to the assault with a transcript for readers who preferred text. It included interviews with Lindsay and Rachel and Brittany, three women who had never met each other, but whose stories aligned with chilling precision. It included Victoria's testimony, the mistress turned witness. It included medical records showing that Caroline's injuries were inconsistent with a fall, expert opinions that the damage could only have been caused by repeated blows. It included the timeline proving Marcus disabled security cameras 13 minutes before the attack. The article did not just accuse, it proved. By noon, the story had 10 million views. By evening, it was the lead segment on every news network. By midnight, the hashtag Marcus Hayes was trending worldwide. His business partners released statements distancing themselves from a man they had praised just weeks before. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. His parents, who had stood by him through everything, finally issued a statement. We are shocked and deeply troubled by these revelations. Marcus woke up to find his face on every screen. His phone was flooded with calls from lawyers and accountants and former friends, all asking the same question. How bad is this going to get? The answer came the next morning. FBI agents arrived at Victoria's penthouse at 6 a.m. Marcus was in bed when the knock came. He reached for his phone to call his attorney. The agents did not wait. Marcus Hayes, you are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. He was handcuffed in his pajamas. The silk fabric that cost more than most people's weekly paycheck wrinkled under the grip of federal agents who treated him like any other criminal. A photographer Elena had tipped off captured the image from across the street. It appeared on the front page of every newspaper the next day. Marcus being led out of the building in restraints, hair disheveled, face slack with shock. The caption read, "How the Mighty Fall." Victoria was arrested separately. She did not resist. She did not speak. At the arraignment that afternoon, bail was denied. Flight risk, community danger. Marcus Hayes went from penthouse to holding cell in 12 hours. The trial began 8 months later. 8 months of pre-trial motions and evidence review and legal maneuvering. 8 months of Marcus's attorneys trying every possible strategy to delay, to suppress evidence, to find some loophole that might save their client. Nothing worked. The case went forward. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters lined the walls, notebooks ready, cameras prohibited, but smartphones recording what they could. Spectators filled every available seat, ordinary people who had followed the story and wanted to see justice delivered. Carolyn sat in the front row behind the prosecution. Emma was with Thomas Reed, too young to understand what was happening, too young to be exposed to the details of what her father had done. The prosecution presented its case methodically. Financial experts explained the fraud in terms a jury could understand. How investor money was supposed to build buildings that were never constructed. How the funds were funneled through shell companies and foreign accounts. How the scheme had stolen millions over more than 5 years. Former employees testified about warnings they raised and orders they followed, about documents they were told to destroy, about the culture of silence that protected Marcus from consequences. The women testified. Lindsay Morgan had described being pursued by a powerful man who promised to advance her career, who took what he wanted and then discarded her with money in a contract that guaranteed her silence. Rachel Wade told a similar story. Different details, same pattern. Brittany Cole, Victoria's own sister, explained how she had been seduced and paid off and made to keep secrets that damaged her family in ways she was still discovering. Victoria herself took the stand. She described the penthouse and the wedding plans and the life she thought she was building. She described Marcus's casual cruelty toward the wife he was planning to replace. She described the night he arrived at her door with blood on his shoes and a lie on his lips. Medical experts testified about Caroline's injuries. The pattern of bruises, the internal bleeding, the damage to her abdomen that nearly killed her unborn child. They explained in clinical terms why the injuries could not have resulted from a fall. The security footage was played for the jury. 17 seconds of Marcus grabbing his pregnant wife by the arm. 17 seconds that contradicted every claim he had made. And then Caroline took the stand. She walked slowly to the witness box. Her body had healed, but the memory of those weeks in a coma lingered in her movements. She sat carefully. She looked directly at the prosecutor. "Mrs. Hayes," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what happened on the night of May 15th? Carolyn nodded. She had been preparing for this moment for months. "I discovered that my husband was having an affair. I found evidence of financial fraud in his business. When I confronted him, when I told him I was going to contact my brothers and a lawyer, he attacked me." She described finding the property tax payment that did not belong, the investigation that followed, the penthouse on Madison Avenue, the ultrasound photos, the wedding invitations. She described confronting Marcus, his denial that became anger, his anger that became violence. "What do you remember about the attack?" the prosecutor asked. Carolyn was quiet for a moment. "I remember telling him I knew the truth. I remember him grabbing me. I remember falling. I remember pain." She paused. "I remember thinking I was going to die, and that my baby was going to die with me." The courtroom was silent. "What do you want from this court?" Carolyn looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the trial began. He sat at the defense table in a suit that cost thousands of dollars, his face composed into an expression of practiced concern. But he could not meet her eyes. He stared at the table in front of him. "I want my daughter to grow up knowing that men like him do not always win, that money does not buy immunity, that the truth matters." She paused. "And I want him to spend every day of the rest of his life knowing that I am the one who put him there." David testified next. He described finding the evidence, building the case, protecting witnesses who were threatened for speaking the truth. He spoke calmly, professionally, the way he had been trained to speak during his years in Army intelligence. But when the prosecutor asked about the moment he first saw Caroline in the hospital, his voice broke. "Just for a second. She is my little sister. I was supposed to protect her." Michael testified about the legal strategy, the obstacles they faced, the walls Marcus had built with money and influence. "We grew up believing the system works," he said, "that justice is blind. This case taught me that justice is not blind. It is expensive. And my sister almost died because one man could afford to buy his way out of accountability." Thomas Reed testified about finding Caroline on the floor, about the blood, about the phone call he made despite the threats against his family. He testified about Victoria's visit to the hospital, the words she spoke over Caroline's unconscious body. The defense tried to discredit him. They questioned his motives. They suggested he was seeking revenge against an employer who had not treated him well. Thomas remained calm. "I have worked for the Hayes family for 15 years, he said. "I have no reason to lie. I am telling you what I saw and what I heard. That is all." Marcus did not testify. His attorneys made the strategic decision to keep him off the stand, away from cross-examination, away from questions he could not answer without incriminating himself further. But his silence spoke volumes. Closing arguments lasted 2 days. The defense painted Marcus as a successful businessman targeted by a vindictive wife and her manipulative family. They questioned the credibility of witnesses. They suggested the evidence had been manufactured or manipulated. The prosecution responded with facts, documents that could not be faked, testimony from multiple sources who had no connection to each other, a pattern of behavior that stretched back years, a confession recorded on tape. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Hayes, guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, guilty. Securities fraud, guilty. Money laundering, guilty. Conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. Obstruction of justice, Guilty. Witness tampering. Guilty. Marcus collapsed in his chair. His attorney did not touch him. The judge spoke. Mr. Hayes, you used your wealth as a weapon. You used your power to hurt people who trusted you. You nearly killed your wife and would have let her die to protect yourself. She paused. The law exists to ensure that no one is above accountability. Today, the law fulfills that purpose. The sentence was 45 years. No possibility of parole for 30. Marcus was led away in handcuffs. The cameras captured every step. The image of him being taken through the courtroom doors would become one of the most shared photographs of the year. Victoria had already pleaded guilty. Her testimony against Marcus had earned her a reduced sentence. 4 years in federal prison, deportation upon release, a permanent ban from entering the United States. She was taken away without statement. The woman who had whispered over Caroline's hospital bed disappeared into the system. The courts awarded Caroline everything, all marital assets, full ownership of the properties, control of what remained of Hayes Development after the fraud penalties had been extracted. It was a fortune built on stolen money, and Caroline did not want it. She sold the company piece by piece to legitimate buyers. The proceeds went to the defrauded investors, returning what could be returned. The contractors who had never been paid for their work received settlements. The women Marcus had used and silenced received compensation that no court had ordered but justice demanded. She kept one thing, a small cottage on the coast of Maine. Marcus had bought it years ago as a tax shelter. He had never visited it. He probably did not remember it existed. Caroline made it a home. Thomas Reed refused any payment for his testimony. I did not do it for money, he said when Caroline offered. I did it because it was right. Caroline offered him something better than money. The cottage had a guest house, small but comfortable, overlooking the ocean. She invited him to stay. Not as an employee, as family. Thomas accepted. He became the grandfather Emma never had. He read her bedtime stories. He taught her to fish in the cold Maine waters. He told her about the grandmother she would never meet and the kind of person her mother was before the world tried to break her. Your mama is the strongest person I have ever known, he said one evening while they watched the sunset, and you are going to be just like her. David returned to Virginia, but he visited every month. He taught Emma self-defense, not because the world was dangerous, though it was, but because knowing you could protect yourself changed how you move through it. Strength is not about hurting people, he told her during one of their sessions. It is about knowing you do not have to be afraid. He never married. When friends asked why, he gave different answers depending on his mood. But the truth was simpler than any of them. He already had everything he needed. Michael's career advanced after the Hayes case. It became a landmark in financial crime prosecution, studied in law schools, cited in subsequent cases. The brother who helped bring down a millionaire because the system failed his sister. He was offered a federal judgeship 3 years after the trial. He accepted. At his swearing-in ceremony, Carolyn and Emma sat in the front row. Emma was 5 years old, wearing a dress she had picked out herself, understanding only that something important was happening to Uncle Michael. I became a prosecutor because I believed the system could work, Michael said in his remarks. This case taught me that the system only works when people are willing to fight for it. My sister fought. My brother fought. A housekeeper who had nothing to gain fought. Justice is not given. It is earned. The years passed. Emma grew. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She asked questions about everything and argued with her teachers when she thought they were wrong. She did not remember her father. She knew only what she had been told, that he was a man who had hurt people, that he was in prison for what he had done, that the name she shared with him was not who she was. When she was old enough to understand more, Carolyn told her the full story. The affair, the fraud, the attack, the trial, the family that had come together to fight for justice. Emma listened without crying. When Carolyn finished, she asked one question. Do you still hate him? Carolyn thought about it for a long time. I used to. When I woke up in that hospital bed and learned what he had done. When I saw Victoria holding you in those photographs. When I watched him lie on television. I hated him more than I thought it was possible to hate anyone. She paused. But hate is heavy. It takes up space in your heart that could hold something better. So I let it go. Not for him. For me. For you. For the life we built after he tried to destroy us. Emma was quiet for a while. I am glad you did not let it win, she said finally. Carolyn smiled. Me too. Marcus Hayes served his sentence in a federal prison in Arizona. The man who had worn custom suits now wore orange jumpsuits. The man who had commanded boardrooms now followed orders from guards who did not care about his former wealth. The man who had believed himself untouchable discovered that prison walls did not recognize privilege. He had no visitors. His parents died during his incarceration, separately, 3 years apart. Neither had seen him since the trial. Their estates went to distant relatives and charitable organizations. He wrote letters to Caroline, to Emma, to Victoria, to anyone who might listen. None were answered. Once a year on Emma's birthday, he requested permission to send a card. Every year, it was returned unopened. The empire he had built existed only in court records and business school case studies. His name became a cautionary tale, the title of a chapter about corporate fraud and consequences. He would be 75 years old when he was eligible for release. Medical reports suggested he would not survive that long. Victoria served her 4 years. After her release, she was deported to England, where she had been born. She changed her name, cut her hair, stopped wearing the designer clothes and expensive jewelry that had defined her life with Marcus. Her son, the child she had with Marcus, grew up believing his father died before he was born. It was easier than the truth. She worked as a receptionist at a medical clinic. She lived in a small flat. She did not date. She did not trust. Every night after her son fell asleep, she sat by the window and thought about the choices that had brought her here. She did not regret cooperating with Caroline. That was survival. She regretted everything that came before. Thomas Reed passed away peacefully at 71. He died in the guest house of the main cottage, surrounded by the family he had chosen. Carolyn held his hand as he went. Emma, 13 by then, read him his favorite poem through tears. The funeral drew over 100 people, former colleagues, community members, people whose lives Thomas had touched with simple kindness over decades of quiet service. Carolyn gave the eulogy. Thomas Reed saved my life. Not because he was obligated to, not because anyone was watching, but because he believed that doing the right thing matters, even when it costs you everything. She paused. He taught my daughter that courage is not about being unafraid. It is about being afraid and acting anyway. He taught her that family is not about blood. It is about choice. She looked at the casket. We did not deserve him, but we got to keep him anyway. And for that, I will be grateful every day of my life. 10 years later, the cottage stood on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic. It was not large. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened onto a living room with windows facing the sea, a porch where you could sit and watch storms roll in, or sunsets fade, or stars emerge from the darkness. Carolyn had added to it over the years. A garden in the back where she grew vegetables, a small library filled with books she had always meant to read, a room for Emma that reflected every phase of her daughter's growing interests, from dinosaurs to astronomy to law. The guest house where Thomas had lived stood empty now, preserved exactly as he had left it. Sometimes Emma would sit there in the chair where he used to read and feel connected to something larger than herself. On this particular morning, 10 years after the trial, Carolyn woke early. She made coffee and carried it to the porch. The ocean was calm, waves rolling gently against the rocks below. Seabirds called in the distance. The air smelled of salt and possibility. She was 42 years old. There was gray in her hair that she did not bother to hide. There were lines around her eyes from years of smiling at her daughter, from years of peace after years of struggle. She thought about the woman she had been. 20 years ago, fresh out of college, starting her career at the IRS with dreams of putting away the bad guys. 10 years ago, lying in a hospital bed, not knowing if she would ever see her daughter again. She thought about the woman she had become. Survivor, mother, keeper of a truth that the world had tried to bury. The mail arrived mid-morning. Emma brought it in, sorting through bills and catalogs and the occasional letter from well-wishers who had followed the case and still sent notes of support. One envelope had no return address. Caroline recognized the handwriting immediately. From him? Emma asked. Caroline nodded. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few lines scrawled in Marcus's increasingly unsteady hand. I will never stop. You took everything from me. Carolyn read the words without reaction. She had received hundreds of these letters over the years. Threats at first, then apologies, then begging, then threats again. An endless cycle of a man who could not accept that his actions had consequences. She walked to the fireplace. She dropped the letter into the flames and watched it burn. "Who was that from?" Emma asked. "No one important," Carolyn replied. David arrived that weekend. He was 50 years old now. His hair had gone gray. His face carried more lines than it used to, but his eyes were the same. Alert, watchful, ready for whatever came next. He brought gifts, a telescope for Emma, who had become fascinated with astronomy, a bottle of wine for Caroline, from a vineyard they had visited years ago during a rare vacation. They sat on the porch after dinner. Emma was inside, setting up the telescope, excited to search the night sky for planets. "How are you?" David asked. "Good, really good. Still getting the letters? Still burning them?" David nodded. He stared at the ocean, watching the last light fade. "You know, I still think about that night sometimes. Finding you on the floor, thinking you might be dead. I know, I would have killed him, you know. If the law had not worked, I would have made him disappear, and I would have slept fine every night after." Caroline did not respond. She knew her brother. She knew what he was capable of. She knew what he had almost done during those dark days when the system seemed to be failing them. "But you did not want that," he said. "No. Why?" Caroline thought about the question. She had asked herself the same thing many times, because if you had killed him, Emma would have grown up knowing that justice came from violence, that when the system fails, we become the system. She looked at her brother. I wanted her to know that the system can work, that truth can win, that monsters can be beaten without becoming monsters yourself. David nodded slowly. Did it work? Carolyn watched Emma through the window. Her daughter was bent over the telescope, adjusting lenses, searching for light that had traveled millions of miles to reach her. "Ask me in another 10 years. Michael called that night. He was 46 now, a federal judge with a reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for abuse of power. His courtroom was known as a place where the wealthy could not buy their way out of consequences. "Just wanted to check in," he said. "Emma still want to be a lawyer? This week she wants to be an astronaut. Last week it was marine biologist." "Good, let her be everything. How is the bench? Hard, fair, important. That is all we can ask." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Carolyn, I am proud of you. I do not say it enough. You say it every time you call. Then I will say it again. I am proud of you. What you serve at, what you built. Who Emma is becoming. I did not do it alone. No. But you did do it." Marcus Hayes died in prison in 2047. He was 75 years old. He had served 28 years of his sentence. He would have been eligible for parole in 2 more years, though everyone knew it would have been denied. He died in the prison hospital, alone except for the nurses who checked on him and the machines that measured his failing body. No family came. No friends visited. No one claimed his remains. The obituary ran in one local newspaper. 3 sentences. A former real estate developer convicted of fraud and attempted murder. No survivors listed. No memorial service planned. His ashes were scattered in an unmarked location by prison staff who had other duties to attend to. The man who had believed himself untouchable disappeared from the world without ceremony. The beach stretched for miles. Carolyn and Emma walked along the water's edge, barefoot, letting the cold waves wash over their feet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange and pink. Emma was 16 now, tall like her mother, stubborn like her mother, smart in ways that sometimes surprised even Caroline. She had asked questions about her father over the years. Not many, just enough to understand what had happened and who she was and who she was not. She knew she carried his name, but not his nature. She knew she came from violence, but was not defined by it. She knew that the family she had was not the family she was born with, but the family that had chosen her. "Mom," Emma said as they walked, "can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever regret it? Not forgiving him, I mean. Sending him to prison instead of just taking the money and walking away?" Caroline thought about the question. She had asked herself variations of it many times. In the early years when the trial was consuming her life. In the middle years, when the letters kept coming. In the quiet years when she had time to reflect on everything that had happened. No, she said finally, I do not regret it. Why not? Because it was not about him. It was about the truth. About making sure that what he did was known and remembered and punished. About making sure that other women he might have hurt knew they were not alone. She paused. And it was about you, about making sure you grew up knowing that justice matters, that even powerful people have to face consequences, that the truth can win if you fight for it hard enough. Emma nodded slowly. I think I want to be a lawyer, she said, not an astronaut or a marine biologist. A lawyer. Carolyn smiled. Any particular kind? Domestic violence. Helping women like you. Women who go through what you went through. Carolyn stopped walking. She turned to face her daughter. This girl who had been born into trauma and raised in peace. This girl who could have been defined by her father's crimes but had chosen to be defined by her mother's strength. That would make me very proud. They walked in silence for a while. The sun continued its descent. The waves continued their endless rhythm. Mom, yes, I love you. I love you too, baby. More than anything in the world. They reached the point where the beach curved back toward the cottage. The lights were on inside. Uncle David was visible through the window, probably preparing dinner. The guest house stood dark, preserved in Thomas's memory. Race you back, Emma said suddenly. She took off running before Caroline could respond. Long legs carrying her across the sand, hair streaming behind her, laughter echoing in the salt air. Caroline watched her for a moment. Then she ran too. Not as fast as she once could, not as gracefully, but running nonetheless, chasing her daughter toward home. They reached the cottage, breathless and laughing. David met them at the door with amused confusion. What was that about? Nothing, Caroline said, just living. They had dinner together. David had made pasta, the recipe he had learned from their mother decades ago. They talked about everything and nothing. Emma described her latest project at school. David told stories from his work that were probably classes of age, but made them laugh anyway. Michael called in the middle of dessert and talked on speakerphone while they passed around ice cream. After Emma went to bed, Caroline sat on the porch alone. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The same stars Emma searched for with her telescope. The same stars that had watched over Caroline during the darkest nights of her life. She thought about the woman she had been. Pregnant, trusting, blind. She thought about the woman she became. Broken, hospitalized, helpless. She thought about the woman she was now. Whole, free, at peace. The journey between those women had been long and painful. There had been moments when she did not think she would survive. Moments when the darkness seemed stronger than any light she could muster. But she had survived. She had fought. She had won. Not because she was special, not because she had some gift that others lacked, because she had people who loved her, because she refused to let the worst day of her life become the definition of every day that followed, because she believed, even when belief seemed foolish, that justice was possible. David appeared beside her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. Thinking deep thoughts? Just remembering. He handed her a glass. They sat together in comfortable silence. She would have been proud of you, he said finally. Mom, if she had lived to see all this. Caroline nodded. Their mother had died when they were young. Cancer, quick and merciless. But her memory lived on in the values she had instilled, in the bond between siblings that survived distance and difficulty. I think about her sometimes, Caroline said. What she would say about everything that happened. She would say, you did good, David replied. She would say you raised a good kid. She would say the pasta was not as good as hers. Caroline laughed. She would be right about that last one. They finished their wine. David went inside. Caroline stayed a moment longer. She looked at the cottage, the lights glowing warm through the windows, her daughter sleeping safely inside, her brother under the same roof, the ocean stretching endlessly into the darkness. This was not the life she had planned. It was better. The final letter arrived 6 months after Marcus died. It came from the prison, a bureaucratic notification that his belongings needed to be claimed or they would be discarded. A form requesting a signature from next of kin. Caroline stared at the envelope for a long time. Then she threw it away without opening it. Emma graduated from law school in 2037. She was 28 years old, top of her class, already recruited by a public interest organization that specialized in domestic violence cases. At her graduation, Carolyn sat in the audience and wept. David sat beside Tish dry-eyed but squeezing her hand so tight it almost hurt. Michael had flown in from Washington specifically for the ceremony. The dean called Emma's name. She walked across the stage, accepted her diploma, and looked out at the audience. She found her mother's face in the crowd. She smiled. Emma's first case involved a wealthy man who had abused his wife for years, who had used money and power to escape consequences, who believed himself untouchable. She won. The verdict came down on a Tuesday afternoon. The abuser was sentenced to prison. His wife received full custody of their children. Justice was served. After the trial, Emma sat in the empty courtroom for a long time. She thought about her mother, about her uncles, about a housekeeper named Thomas Reed who had made a phone call that changed everything. She thought about a man she had never known except through stories, a man whose blood she carried, but whose nature she had escaped. She thought about all the women who would never have their cases heard, who would never see their abusers face justice, who would suffer in silence because the system failed them. She would fight for them. It was why she had become a lawyer, not for money, not for prestige, but because she believed, as her mother believed, that justice was worth fighting for. She stood up. She gathered her files. She walked out of the courtroom and into the sunlight. There was work to do. Caroline Hayes died at 81. She passed peacefully in the cottage by the sea, surrounded by family. Emma was there, holding her mother's hand. David was there, though he was frail now himself. Michael had flown in from Washington despite his own failing health. The grandchildren were there too. Emma's daughter, named Caroline after her grandmother. A bright-eyed girl of 8 who asked too many questions and already talked about becoming a lawyer. The end came quietly, as these things sometimes do. One moment Caroline was there, breathing softly, eyes closed but peaceful. The next moment she was gone. Emma wept, David wept, Michael wept. But the tears were not only grief, they were gratitude for the years they had been given, for the life Caroline had built from the ashes of what Marcus had tried to destroy, for the legacy she left behind in her daughter and her granddaughter, and all the people who had been touched by her story. The funeral was small but significant, a service at the cottage overlooking the ocean she had loved. Words spoken by those who knew her best, memories shared and tears shed, and laughter that surprised no one who understood what Caroline had valued most. Emma read a poem, the same poem she had read at Thomas Reed's funeral decades before. David spoke about his little sister, the girl who had followed him around when they were children, the woman who had fought harder than anyone he knew. Michael spoke about justice, about what it meant and what it cost, and how Caroline had taught him that it was worth every price. The grandchildren spoke about the grandmother who had taught them to be brave. At the end, as the sun set over the ocean, they scattered Caroline's ashes into the water. The wind carried them out to sea. The waves took them where waves have always taken the departed, into memory, into legend, into peace. The final cards appeared on the screen. White text against black, as the story came to its close. Marcus Hayes died in federal prison in 2047. No one claimed his remains. Victoria Cole never returned to the United States. Her son grew up believing his father died before he was born. Thomas Reed is buried on a hill overlooking the ocean. His headstone reads, "He did the right thing." David Mitchell continued protecting his family until his death at 78. He never married. When asked why, he said, "I already have everything I need." Michael Mitchell served on the federal bench for 23 years. He is remembered for a simple principle: no one is above accountability. Emma Hayes graduated from law school in 2037. She became a prosecutor specializing in domestic violence cases. Her first conviction was a wealthy man who believed money made him untouchable. He was wrong. Carolyn Hayes lived to see her granddaughter born. She died at 81 in the cottage by the sea, surrounded by family. Her last words were spoken to Emma, whispered so softly that only her daughter could hear. It was worth it. All of it. And it was.